Luxa, how are you?
Doing pretty good, Doug. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. So I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I'm going to give you the choice. You can either have a pre and a post-show quid pro quo, or I could start with a joke. One of my infamous opener jokes. So it's up to you. What would you prefer?
Pre and post or joke?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, those jokes are so bad that they're good. So I'm going to go with that.
A joke? Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a cruel one, and it's but I'm still going to go with it. Why is it the people that are absolutely obsessed with sex magic and can't stop talking about it look like the kind of people that no one would want to fuck in the first place? That is a riff on a George Carlin joke. And it is incredibly cruel. And of course, I do not mean that in any way.
What are you trying to say to me?
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm a huge fan of George Carlin. So that's my joke. And unfortunately, it's very cruel. But truthfully, we're going to try and keep the cruelty to that joke. And we're going to have a really wonderful time with this podcast. So, hey, everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the paranormal, the supernatural, the esoteric, and the weird. I am joined today by a fantastic guest. They are a magician. They are an occultist. They are a podcast titan. They have probably close to 70 podcasts, I'd say, in and around there, right? And I am joined by the founder of the Green Mushroom Sigil Project. I'm joined by Luxa Strata. Luxa, how are you?
Hey, what's up? Thank you for that generous introduction. I appreciate it. And I'm super stoked to be here.
For sure. You do have a lot of podcasts.
Yes, I am currently participating on 3 podcasts right now.
My goodness.
Which I'm super lucky to be doing and loving, being able to work with so many cool people, and fuck yeah.
They're all great. You have one on history that you help your brother out?
Yeah, my brother has a history podcast that I co-host with him on. It's called Ad Hoc History. It's not the history podcast you wanted. It's the history podcast you deserve.
Nice.
There is also a very embarrassing show that I make with a couple of my buddies called Smuts Up, where we are basically doing like exposure therapy to try to get more comfortable with embarrassing ourselves by talking about sex and also trying to do comedy, which are 2 very, very embarrassing things. So that's been fun. And then, of course, I've got Lux Occult, which is the show where I talk about magic and spirituality and all kinds of other things, the intersections of art and magic and philosophy and science and all that shit. So, yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm just kind of shocked. When I emailed you the other day, I was just like, hey, I sent you an email. You're like, I've got to record a show. Anytime that you have free time, you're just like, got to do a podcast. Or is it your life?
Wait, what are you talking about? What is that word? Those words that you just said? I have no idea what they mean.
Free time?
Free time? What?
I know, right?
I like to stay busy. It keeps me out of trouble.
That's good call. I appeared on your show. When was that? Well, that was back in September or so? September, October?
It's all a blur. I'm not sure. I think it must have been right before October, I believe, because I think it was right before I launched the Green Mushroom Project. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes.
I appeared on your show, what feels like ages ago. So I asked you on this show for a very specific reason. Now, I reached out basically saying, look, I'm going to pitch you something. I'm a bit tired of getting emails about this topic. I'm a little bit tired of hearing about it. I think we need to tackle it because, for one, so many people have asked for it. And another one is that I think there hasn't really been an absolutely wonderful, demystifying, somewhat clear look at the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And so I have asked Luxa on the show to talk about sex magic. That's right. Now,
that's right.
I sent this email. I think it was Instagram. And I was like, oh man, I don't know how somebody's going to take this. Like, this is kind of like a weird one to ask somebody that I've only appeared on their podcast once. Are they just going to be like, no, and then never contact me again?
No, I hate you now.
You're done. You're dead to me, Bachelor.
How dare you ask me on your show that I like so much?
I was worried. It's a strange one because you never know how some people are going to take this kind of stuff. I had my fingers crossed. And then not too short afterward, and luckily enough for everybody, you said, oh, absolutely, 100%. I'm down. I'm more than down. This is my jam. And I was like, oh, That's great. So I have to ask you, why were you so enthused to talk about sex magic?
I think it is a really interesting topic, and it's something that I do think a lot about. I think it's really important. There's a lot of mystery, I think, that surrounds it that doesn't really need to be there. Maybe it does. I mean, that's just my own opinion, but I think that in general, it can be demystified in a way that can help people gain access, and through access, gain agency.
I think so as well. I hope that we'll take that as an ambition, and we'll get down and, dare I say it, dirty with sex magic. I warn everybody, there's going to be a lot of puns and entendres. It's going to be all over the place. So if you can't stand my usual punnery, then this is definitely not the show to listen to. But if you can stomach that, then you're very brave, and let's get into it.
Absolutely.
Firstly, a whole show about a technique of magic is, in a way, I think, a little bit difficult, let alone something as personalized and vast as sex magic is. Lux, I have to ask, how would you generally describe sex magic?
Well, I think that the most general way to sum it up would be to say that sex magic or sexual magic involves using sexual energies to cause change to occur in accordance with will, going with Crowley's definition of working magic there. So you're using your own or partner's sexual energies to focus to achieve results.
Right. That's definitely probably the definition that most people would put on sex magic. I'm a little bit more broad. I just say basically like any sexual activity done in conjunction with rituals and spells. That's it.
And I think, we could even expand the definition out to beyond saying like just to cause a result. It gets a little semantically sticky, but a lot of people explore these types of practices for personal development reasons in addition to making things happen.
Absolutely, yeah. It's all part of the package, seemingly. Many say that sex magic is one of the most potent magical techniques that there is. And this is something that we'll get into it for sure, but I think that it's tough because to say something like sex magic, well, what exactly is sex? And I know it's such a loaded word because we all have our own personal definitions as to what entails sex, or at least intercourse in some way. But does it stop at erotica? Where does anything erotic enter into the equation? Where exactly does the sex in sex magic fit in? Again, if you're going to take a pun, but sorry. Things are, I think, a little bit loose. Again, another pun. But that's part of the problem. Before we totally jump in here, I just want to have like a small little disclaimer, and it might enter into this discussion a little bit, but I want to have a word about Tantra. We're going to try and keep this discussion about sex magic in the West for the most part. Now, the traditions and techniques of using sex for spiritual and ritual in the East is vast. They've been doing this stuff for a long time, and truthfully, like an entire podcast could be done about such things as Eastern sex-based practices for spirituality. Here's something that I really want people to get into their heads, and it's the last I'm going to talk about it maybe in this episode, but no, Tantra does not equal sex, okay?
So, Thank you.
Yeah. Most books about Tantra that are out there that you'll find in like occult sections or things about sex magic, they're laughably awful. They're usually written by people who have little to no idea about what they're talking about. And as for things like Kundalini, it's usually a mess in some way. A lot of these things can be traced back to almost one individual by the name of Pierre Bernard. He called himself the Magnificent Om. Interesting character, look him up. He was an American businessman. I believe he was born in Iowa. There's pictures of him with his shirt off and sitting in a lotus position. He was kind of the one that like made everybody think that Tantra equals sex. And that's been a label that has stuck for a long period of time. I just want to say it's tough in this episode. We can't go into a lot of the stuff that's from the East. There's so much of it. It is incredibly vast. So yeah, we're going to be sticking with the West and Western conceptions of sex magic.
Yeah, Doug, you're totally right about Tantra too. It's a complete holistic practice. It's not just about sex either. It's like a whole thing. Like there's a sexual component of it, just like there's a sexual component to most adult lifestyles, but it's not a explicitly sexual practice. People seem to think it might be, as far as I understand it.
Yeah. So. I think the term Tantra literally means like method. I mean, I could be a little bit shaky on that. It's just a way of operating. And it's huge within several cultures, within Buddhism and Shaktiism and Hinduism. It's a big thing, right? And so it's really tough. But yeah, we're going to be trying to stick with the West. So
maybe we should have a quick discussion about consent since we're going to be talking about sex. I think that consent is an excellent place to start. Do you consent to this?
Definitely. Go ahead.
Okay. Just, real quick, because a lot of people seem to be confused about this sometimes. Consent, it's not optional, right? It's not a one-time only thing. It needs to be enthusiastic and it needs to be ongoing.
Yeah.
It's pretty much that simple, though. So.
And one of the things that we just touched on before we even set the microphone up is that some figures that promulgate sex magic say that it's, don't let your partner know that you're engaging in sex magic if you are indeed using a partner.
Yeah, I think I remember Crowley saying something like, one's partner should be ignorant of the sacredness of the office.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I don't know about that either. I don't think I agree.
I will fully admit that I have done sex magic without a partner's consent, and I felt terrible about it at the time, and I just kind of gave up. And I've never done it again. It's just one of those things that when you're younger, and I don't want to do this, be like, oh, young Doug, and use that as an excuse, but it didn't feel right. It did not feel good in any way.
And that I'm sure that made it pretty much impossible for you to actually conduct the operation successfully, right? Because not only is it ethically questionable, but it will probably make it difficult for you to actually do the thing.
Do the thing, exactly. Yes, the idea of consent is an incredibly pertinent one. It's not just currently, but going forward, consent is crucial. That's one of the things that I think that everybody needs to get into their heads. And we'll get into a little bit more of the, shall we say, darker side of sex magic a little bit further on down the line. But yes, very good place to start, Luxa, with consent.
Just a little housekeeping,
Yeah. I mean, one would hope that we wouldn't have to say such things.
I love the optimism and the idealism. I just think it's always good to start there.
Yeah. With that, as we do, because this is what magic is, let's get into a little bit of history of Western sex magic. Now, it's tough to find like an origin story of Western sex magic. A lot of people would say that it started in the East and then it drifted into the West. From what we can tell if we squint, it probably started with something called Orgasm, which means sacred marriage. By origin, it was Thracian, so that is where Bulgaria is now, and we're talking way before the Common Era. This is BCE, right? In a way, it is a ritual played between usually two people, and it's usually done by royalty in some way, standing in for gods and goddesses. Some scholars are quick to state that, and specifically classicists, they'll say like, well, this doesn't always mean that they were sex rituals. And I'm sure that this was the case, but also in a lot of ways, come on, it was about sex.
Yes. I'd like to point out just real quick, gamos, marriage and gamete, like a sperm or an egg is the biological term for that. So, I mean, even the way that we understand like that word root is kind of just, it's just all tangled up in there, right? Like
it's baked in. So some examples of what could be used for something like Orgasm would be, in the Greek sense, it would be the man would play Zeus or stand in for Zeus and the woman would stand in for Hera, right? Thracian kings, they would personify heroes during Orgasm. They would be wed in a ritual, and they would bed the mother of the gods, which would be a somewhat virginal figure. Now, not a ton is known about Orgasm, as it was a bit of a mystery tradition for the most part throughout Thrace and throughout Greece. But a lot of that stuff is just lost to us in time, unfortunately. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but as far as like trying to say like there's an origin of sex rituals within the West, that's about as great as we have. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Luxa.
I think that makes sense. Even things like the Great Rite in, the Wiccan tradition goes right back to that, right? This kind of ritual role-playing where we're playing the gods, I guess. I don't know.
I'm going to have something more to say about this role-playing towards the end of the episode because truthfully, I think it's something that Not enough people do. I think this is a little bit more unexplored territory for a lot of sex magic. We'll save that for a little bit later. In something like practical magic, I go about as far back as the Greek magical papyri, or the PGM. Now, there are no sex spells to speak of within the PGM because a lot of these were, the papyri themselves, they were written by priests who, for a certain segment of the year, they would be doing their priestly duties and they would have to be celibate, right? And then when they weren't priests, they would be jobbing magicians, jobbing sorcerers. Now, the PGM does have love spells, and the love spells are interesting. Say that I agree with Stephen Skinner here, who wrote a lot about Greco-Egyptian magic, and he basically says that the love spells, they have a bit of a twist in the sense that, I've said it before, they're a bit icky because they want the person that is the target of the spell to suffer before they become this person's lover. It's really, really iffy. Like I want their like really
Whoa.
suffer like 1,000 tortures before they fall in love with me. People were they were pretty hardcore back in the day.
Intense. Yeah, that's an intense vibe.
Yeah, but no sex spells as we can see in the PGM. But as far as love spells, those are in there. Love spells have always kind of been around, I'd say. But
What is your opinion of love spells in general, just while we're on the topic?
I don't do them because I've had disastrous results. From experience, yeah, it's a case of, and this might sound really trite, but it's a case of be careful what you wish for and what you target for. When you say, I want, as an example, and perhaps I'm speaking from experience here, up for people to judge, but if you're targeting for an interesting partner, interesting, in air quotes, has a lot of things to read into it as far as how interesting they are and what makes them interesting. I got burned. The first 3 years of my magical proclivities were mainly chaos magic based. One of the first sigils I ever cast was to lose my virginity, and it worked. And it was good for a while, and then things went real bad, real fast, causing a lot of hardship I had to kind of rectify in my mind. So as far as love spells, I'm not a huge fan. What about yourself?
Yeah, I think that, again, from a ethical standpoint, any time that you're trying to infringe on somebody else's agency, you're coming up against issues of consent and stuff. So in that specifically, I would really urge people to think carefully about. But as you're saying too, I do think that it's incredibly powerful and incredibly scary. And if you're going to fuck with it, you should be very careful.
Yeah. The love spells can lead in weird ways. They can lead to disastrous results. They can lead to stalkerish behavior in some people.
Well, yeah, I think we like to think about love maybe in sort of a idealized Disney fairy tale kind of a way, but that ignores the darker aspects of it, the things obsession or possession or things like that, and one of the most powerful and motivating human emotions. So tread lightly.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. I will not say that I have not done it. I have. It was one of the first spells that I did. It worked incredibly fast and I suffered because of it. And the other person did as well. And some other people did as well. That was the other thing, is that it was not just isolated to myself and the other person involved.
And I think this story about using love magic and having it blow up in your face is something that a lot of practitioners have. I think this was actually one of the first things that I did as well when I was a younger person, and I had instant regret as well. It worked, unfortunately.
Yeah, I wouldn't say for myself it was instant regret, but it was a several servings of regret over a period of years. So, yeah, that's how she goes.
Okay. Well, you heard it here first, everybody. Be careful.
Be careful out there. Just think before you do something. I know a lot of people are hurting. A lot of people are feeling very lonely. There's other ways of doing things. Really is. You don't have to immediately default to magic, I think.
Totally. And if you are, I think there's ways of saying well, I would like to enchant for having a broader circle of friends that share my interests or something like that.
100%.
That actually is another, I would classify that as a type of love magic,
Sure.
So
I agree. Yeah. The enchanting for opportunity, I think, is a thing that a lot of people need to get when they start out in magic. I shared on a recent podcast with Devin Person an Abre Camino spell, when that's just about allowing yourself to be open to opportunity, right? That is a very safe and a far more enchanting way of using magic. Taking an apple and incanting words over the apple and then trying to get this person to eat that apple, like that's a bit much. That's actual like Greek.
I'm just imagining how this would go down. Like they like come over to your house and you're like, how about an apple? And they're like, no, I'm good. You're like, no, here, eat this apple.
Eat this apple.
Like, that doesn't seem like a super good way to get somebody to like you.
No, it does not. Just eat the apple. So what are we having for dinner? Oh, we're going to have an apple. Just one apple.
Yeah. And there's also something to be said too, and I know this point comes up a lot as well, and if you're going to be using magic to try to get a partner or get some romantic event to happen, like it would be much easier to enchant yourself to be more attractive, or work on yourself, do some personal development. That's the
100%. Yeah.
Even if you're not successful in the thing you're doing it for, you'll still have residual success with other things. So yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell people, like, one of the best ways of improving your confidence, it doesn't require magic. It's if you have a really nice suit or a very beautiful dress or any kind of clothing, a kilt, I don't care, but something that you hold in high esteem, put it on and then walk around a busy part of town. It's not magic. It does something, right?
Sure. And you know what? If it helps you to contextualize it as magic, then do that.
Exactly.
Because you could say, oh, well, I'm this other person while I'm wearing this magical item, and look at how confident I am in it. I don't know. Whatever works for you, right?
Exactly. So from that, we're going to move to the Gnostics. For those that don't know who the Gnostics are, it's kind of like an umbrella term. Gnosticism it's early Jewish and Christian sects. That's SECTS. Everybody, right? Sects that concentrated on direct knowledge of God, or which they called gnosis, right? Or gnosis. Now, it started in and around the 1st century CE. The details of the activities of Gnostics, because they were so dispersed, they're a little bit shaky, but sex was ritualized in some cases. And we have some evidence for this. It's not great evidence, but it's there. A lot of it is about the use of bodily fluids. A lot of it is about the location in which one would engage in intercourse. So the power of sex was seen to the Gnostics as a route to gnosis, or gnosis, which becomes important actually for later developments within sex magic itself. If people are interested in this aspect, there's a great book called Sex Mysteries of the Gnostics by Tobias Churton. It'll be up in the show notes, as well as a book called The Rose of Crucifixion by Jake Stratton Kent. It's got a chapter about some of the activities of the Gnostics. This is a big thing, I think, as well, specifically more so with the use of bodily fluids within ritual. Again, not a ton of evidence, but we can kind of say that it's there in a way. And a lot of scholars of Gnosticism would be like, it's an iffy subject within studies of Gnosticism. Just trying to get people's heads around Gnosticism is like the first goal. And then once we do that, then maybe we can start talking about this stuff. So it's still early stages for this, I think. Have you ever bumped up against the Gnostics in any of your stuff, Luxa?
Oh, yeah. Several of my friends are really interested in Gnostic tradition and stuff. And so, yeah, it's something that I haven't personally like dabbled in as a paradigm for myself, but I have a passing familiarity with it. Yeah, they're really interesting, and I hope, knock on wood, I should have an episode about Gnosticism out here in the next 3 months. Fingers crossed. I need some things to fall in. So. It's fascinating stuff, and gosh, a lot there. Really cool stuff for sure. Yeah, they're eminently fascinating. A lot of people say that we're kind of like living in the Gnostic New Age right now. Just a lot of people are going to the idea of the Gnostics viewed God in a very interesting way, or specifically what we would call the Abrahamic God, as a harmful force than a force for good. It was like basically the God who thinks that he's God isn't actually God. Yeah. It's a different, bigger God that isn't exactly as involved, but the lower God, the demiurge, doesn't understand that. Yeah. And he's kind of a butthole, and yeah, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. Yes. Yeah, but I do like the fact that they thought that in some way, people that have the scriptures and people that gatekeep religion in some way, that's garbage. It's about your direct knowledge, and nobody can tell you what that is. Or more importantly, nobody can tell you what that's not, right?
And so one of the ways of achieving that was through something as profound and as delightful as sex. Moving on from them, of course, we have to talk a little bit about Christianity. Now, Christianity does its thing, and it's tough because a lot of the ways that the early church thought about sex are very different than the conceptions of Christianity that we have now. It's tough to pick apart. Truthfully, I could do a whole episode about Christianity and sex, but this is not the time or the place, because Christianity had such a huge grasp on magic, and a lot of people I still have problems wrapping their heads around this. For a long time, most of the people that were magicians were deeply Christian. They were incredibly Christian. Agrippa was Christian. I got a YouTube comment, Agrippa wasn't Christian. Did you read Agrippa? I don't understand. John Dee was very religious. So all of these people were very religious, but they were also doing magic, specifically for something like the grimoires or the vernacular grimoires or grimoires that weren't in Latin. There's no sex magic in there. It's non-existent. If people might provide me an example, I'd be happy to put a correction in the show notes, but I read a lot of grimoires. It's my thing, and there's nothing in them for sex magic. To get back to love spells, though, what does occur is that love spells start to proliferate in European folk magic. A lot of the times they're specifically directed by and for women. Now, people have to understand that being a woman back in the day was incredibly precarious in certain areas. A lot of times it was about a marriage, and staying married was a very important thing to ensure that the person that you're married to wouldn't go to find somebody else other than you.
Yeah, if that happened, you would be completely disenfranchised.
Yeah.
It could really spell disaster for all aspects of your life, totally.
Yeah. These spells, they're incredibly fascinating, these love spells. It's mainly directed for women. It's somewhat indicative of the kind of like powerlessness that a lot of women felt at the time, right? This to me, I really find fascinating. To get back a little bit of this power, and my latest episode with Aaron Hodges about cunning folk, love spells.
So good. I loved it. Yeah.
Love spells was like a huge part of what cunning folk did. And it's just to ensure for the women that they have some kind of agency to be able to maintain things in their life that were very important to them.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. You know, this idea of occultism or spirituality being a way that you can get agency when there's really very few other ways to do it. I think that makes sense that you see this being associated with women a lot of times, because those were often the people that were in this position. So yes.
A lot of them definitely probably felt like their backs were up against the wall with a lot of the way that they lived their life. And magic helps those people. Magic is a great way of helping people who feel that they have their back against the wall. So
sure. And I mean, I do want to say too that this is probably the case in a lot of parts of the world still too. So it's not as though we've solved this problem and everything's all good. But yes, totally.
We certainly have not. So to move on from there to the 19th century. The 19th century is when things start changing. A lot of people are less fearful of the church and being able to say things. You have the Enlightenment ideas starting to occur as well. It's not like women take a huge step forward. Something like sex magic, it takes an enormous step forward in the 19th century. And this is going to be due to a couple of figures that Luxa and I will go through. Our conceptions of modern sex magic, they get firmed up in the mid to late 19th century, for better and for worse for almost everybody.
All right. I was laughing when you said firmed up.
Hey, I missed one. Dang. Well spotted. Thank you. Perfect. Taking things a little bit further from them, one figure, Alistair Crowley, he becomes the one-stop shop for sex magic in the early 20th century. Basically, for the entire 20th century, the genie was let out of the bottle with Alistair Crowley, and it became just something that was intrinsically tied to magic. Sex magic became a way that people would think about magic, and in some ways it would like replace magic. There's some books that you can read from like the early 70s that are just like, all magic is sex magic, and I'm just like, wait, what? I don't know if you read your history, sir. And I say sir because it's usually men that are writing these books.
Shocking revelation.
I know, right? The 60s. The 60s is a very strange time. Again, a whole podcast could go over it, but you get things like New Age ideas. So they're taking a lot of ideas that are, I'm just going to say, like heavily Orientalized, things like Tantra, and they're kind of stuffing it in with Western ceremonial magic. You have the birth control pill. You have Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson. They kind of turn Crowley into like a psychedelic. He was like a child of the 60s before the 60s, man. So yeah, they reconceptualized Crowley. And I don't think they read Crowley very well, truthfully. Now, people might argue with me, but I'm not saying they're wrong, but it's a very slight reading of Aleister Crowley. Eventually, everybody just wants in sex magic. And from there, things go forward. There's the fallout from the 60s. Later on, you have chaos magic, and they're looking into the work of somebody like Austin Osman Spare, as well as Crowley, and things like sigil magic become a thing. One of the most operant ways of using sigil magic is by using the sigil and then taking yourself to the point of orgasm. And at the point of orgasm, you hold the sigil in your mind, and then you forget about the sigil, and eventually it will come true. That's pretty much sex magic. I consider that sex magic. I don't know about you, but...
Oh, yeah, the masturbation sigil thing? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that people do associate that with chaos magic, but that is certainly not the only way to charge a sigil. I will just say that, and that is certainly not all that chaos magic is about.
No.
Yes.
It's what it was known for a long period of time because, of course, sex is sensationalized in a lot of ways, but... No, it's not the only thing that the chaos magicians were about at all. Again, sir, did you read your history? But nowadays, sex magic is just another part of magic. The Crowley veneer has been removed somewhat from sex magic because of many reasons. Sex magic is, I think it's lost a little bit of its naughtiness in a way. I think this can be good, and I think this can be a little bit strange, and we'll get into this later, but many people engage in sex magic, many people support it, and many people make it like the largest part of their practice, and will definitely tell you so. But people are also making a lot of money selling books and having classes on how to engage in sex magic. It's just how it goes. And so that's, I guess, short history of Western sex magic. Did you think I missed anything there, Luxa?
I think that was pretty thorough. I might have mentioned Anton LaVey because I think that he did a lot in terms of openly talking about like using stuff like kink and everything.
Yeah.
He's in the mix in there somewhere, but other than that, definitely.
Yeah. LaVey is a weird one. Yeah, definitely Anton LaVey had a huge hand in it. Specifically adding that extra element of naughtiness made sex magic naughty again.
Yeah,
right? For a short
and
period
I think
of time.
that he understood that for some people that would make it work better.
Yeah.
There is a category of kink where people are into things because they're taboo. This is from like a psychological perspective, like studying this stuff. So yeah, that's a whole thing that, if it's taboo, it might be a little more fun, right? It's naughty, I guess.
It gives it a bit more juice, if you will.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, goodness. Let's talk about a couple of figures. So, Luxa, free association here. When I say sex magician, who is the first person that comes into your mind?
Well, unfortunately, it's Crowley.
Yeah. So it's going to be Aleister Crowley.
But that wouldn't be my touchstone in terms of, obviously hugely important. I know that people find a lot of value in, working through his system, and I'm not in any way disparaging people's experiences or anything like that. I think that that's awesome. People should 100% do what works for them. For me, a lot of the stuff that it doesn't jive with how I think about it. And that's, yes, I don't know. I've heard from people who are members of the OTO that a lot of times you just kind of like don't think too hard about Crowley.
Yeah.
Which is okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
People, if you say sex magician, the first person that they're going to say is usually going to, 90% of the time is going to be Aleister Crowley. But I'm going to say here, if you listen to this show, I don't want you to think Aleister Crowley when I say sex magician. I want you to think of somebody else by the name of Paschal Beverly Randolph. All right? Now, Paschal Beverly Randolph is basically the guy from which most if not all of our conceptions of sex magic, or at least by activation of sex magic, they come from his work. Aleister Crowley took from Paschal Beverly Randolph. Maria de Niclowska took from Paschal Beverly Randolph. The OTO took from Paschal Beverly Randolph. Everybody has taken from Paschal Beverly Randolph. So when somebody says sex magician, I want you to think of this guy. And not a lot of people know about him, which is, it's a shame. It's a real shame. Now, some people have said that this might be because of the fact that he was mixed race, and he was. He was half white, half black, but he was also a doctor, and he was a lecturer. He would lecture all over the place, like all over America, but he was also an occultist. He called himself the Rosicrucian, and he established the earliest known Rosicrucian order within the U.S., an order which these days says they have nothing to do with Paschal Beverly Randolph, which is a bit of a shame, I think. But he was born in New York in 1825. This order that he founded, and more of his magic, it had all of the regular Masonic Rosicrucian air to it and stuff, but he boldly added sex magic. It was blatant within his form of occultism. Now, what this was is, stop me if this sounds familiar, but it was holding an idea of what you want, or your will, or the law, in your mind while doing your thing. And that's at base what we get from Paschal Beverly Randolph. Now, many people could say that, well, people would have just come to that eventually. I think that's pretty revolutionary for its time.
Totally. And I think, yeah, the other thing that comes to mind with considering Randolph, too, is his use of, the fluids, which becomes very important in some later traditions of this. He referred to them as the magnetic fluids.
Yeah.
Because in his conception of things, depending on what genitalia you have, you'll have a positive or negative charge in your head, which will be opposite that of what is in your junk.
Yes.
And by hooking up with others, you can make these kind of circuits. And Magica Sexualis, his book, is full of such diagrams as these little, they're almost like little electric diagrams.
Yeah. Conduit.
Very hilarious.
Yes, conduit diagrams.
But actually, you know what? I'll just really quickly from, experimental standpoint note that actually does make sense in terms of thinking about this as like a kind of current that can flow. Mm-hmm. So that actually tracks for me a little bit. So,
yeah.
Yes.
Randolph, again, I'll say it. If, of course, he used somewhat nascent technological or scientific terms to describe a lot of things, and that's just what happens within the occult, or pretty much anywhere. We use the technology that's around to try and explain things. Randolph did this in a big way. He's an incredibly fascinating guy. I would love to do an episode on Paschal Beverly Randolph. He died in Toledo at the age of 49 under very shady circumstances. Apparently, they said it was a suicide, but this is a guy who wrote constantly about not committing suicide.
Yes. There's some talk that he might have been killed by a rival of his, a romantic rival. We're not sure.
Yeah. If sex magic is interesting to you and has been, or at least if it's like a part of your life and you do not know who Paschal Beverly Randolph is, you owe it to him. Owe it to him to find out about this man. Because very brave, he could have easily have been persecuted, and he was, but he was steadfast in what he did. He would not back down.
Yeah. The other thing I will note, too, is that it makes mention of the male ejaculating in the book, but it also seems to mention a female orgasm, which I was shocked to find in such an old text. I was like, wow, they actually knew that was a thing, or he acknowledged it, or whatever it was. But yes, I do want to note, though, that this was translated into French by Maria de Niclowska, so that could have been one of her editions. We're not sure.
Yeah, so, it's up to debate, but he's a bit of a dynamo, as far as this kind of stuff, way ahead of his time. Again, before Crowley, and everybody took from Paschal Beverly Randolph. So, sex magician, think of this guy. It's not Crowley. I know that Crowley gets all the credit, but also incredibly influential is Ida Craddock. Ida is a tragic story. It is an incredibly sad story of her, but also a very brave and very bold person. She was a sexual reformer and a woman's right advocate before there was such a thing. Now, she wrote mainly about sex. She's got several books. One of her books, Heavenly Bridegrooms, was one of Aleister Crowley's favorite books. He said everybody should read this book. It is one of the most important books ever. But my favorite book is a book called Psychic Wedlock, which, for a name, start a band. make a movie. I want Psychic Wedlock somewhere. But it's an interesting book. It has I think 3 degrees. It goes through a lot of really interesting stuff. Mythology and eroticism and deity, or the deity, is mixed up in there in a very 19th century kind of way. She was constantly thrown in prison for obscenity. Her books were burned. She would be sent to jail for trying to send her books, mail books. People were going through her mail to find ways of nailing her.
Yes, this actually comes up a number of times, this Comstock thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that I thought was interesting about Craddock is that she could have been one of the first, or the first female undergraduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, because she passed the entrance exams, but then she was blocked from attending this school by the Board of Trustees, again, highlighting the how awesome it was to be a woman in those times.
Yeah. You touched on it there for a sec. So she does have her arch nemesis, as every wonderful hero. And I do think that Ida Craddock is a hero. For every hero, they need their arch nemesis. And that was a gentleman by the name of Anthony Comstock. A little bit of an aside. Why is everybody named Comstock evil? I think if you're named Comstock, you have to be evil.
It's just, I guess it's just the resonance of that name is just evil. I don't know.
It's so strange. This man, he was an anti-vice activist. His goal in life was to crush Ida Craddock, and he tried his darndest. So Craddock was in and out of jail at several points. In 1902, Comstock had Craddock rearrested literally right after she got out of jail for 3 months, and she was handed another 5-year prison term. Ida was 45 at the time she got this. She'd already been to prison. She knew what prison was about. Prison was not a pleasant place to be back in that day.
It was like a work prison or something like that. Yeah, it was like breaking rocks or something. I don't know. It
was meant to break you. It was basically its ambition. And at 45 years old, she's just like, I can't do this. So she killed herself. She basically slashed her wrists and stuck her head into an oven with the gas on. And yeah, she ended her life because she knew that she wouldn't be able to survive another 5 years in prison.
That's so sad. She's a little bit more history about her. She was like I guess you would say maybe like spectrophile. Like she had this relationship with this angel, I believe. Yeah. She contextualized it as this, I think it was Soph.
Soph, yeah.
Yeah, Soph. So Soph was her angel dude, her ethereal lover. So maybe it would be easier to, I don't know, to think about things that way if you were already sort of like half in this other world. I don't know. Yeah. It's a tragic story, though.
She's very tragic. She was also very big in something called Dianism, which I literally only found out about a week ago. And I was like, oh, this is interesting stuff. But I don't know if I can talk about it too much because I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. But it seems like the point of this kind of arousal than it is about reaching the end, the finish line, if you will. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff for sure. But Ida Craddock, I think she's a hero of sex magic, truthfully. A lot of these people are very bold, very courageous in what they did at a time when everything said that you can be crushed for this. And Craddock was. She really, really was. Read her stuff, particularly Heavenly Bridegrooms, particularly Psychic Wedlock. Very interesting. Definitely give them a read. So now we have to get to the big one, and here's where we disappoint nearly everybody. Yeah, we're going to talk about Alistair Crowley and the OTO. If you're looking at sex magic or reading a book about sex magic that's available in most stores, most likely on offer will be ripped wholesale from Crowley. Now, I think that the term sexually active does not even come close to describing Alistair Crowley. He was ravenous. Like, I don't want to call him a delinquent, but in some cases he definitely did some things that were like, that's interesting. And a lot of that has been shoved under the carpet, but I'll cover it in an episode about Alistair Crowley. He wrote about sex constantly. He has over 9 works that are specifically about sex magic. His diary. If you've ever read his diaries, have you read his diaries, Luxa?
No.
Okay, they're weird. He's got like pseudonyms for the kind of sex that he's having.
I haven't read them, but I've heard about it. I do want to say though, like just contextualizing it, like a lot of the stuff that he was doing was technically illegal too, like in Britain. Yeah. So there's probably some reasons that you might want to like use these euphemisms too, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. But also in a way, I think Crowley thought he was very clever. I thought
he thought he was super clever.
Yeah, he thought he was a hilarious man. And in some ways, he can be very funny. But
there's some funny stuff, like the 11th operation. I think that's funny.
Yeah.
11th or whatever. That's funny.
Yeah.
Like 2 1s. I don't know.
Yeah.
Funny.
There's things like opera is a name for one. Opus, I believe PVN is one of them. I believe that he's talking specifically about anal sex in that case. I think that translates. I forget what it actually means, but it's like without the vessel. Anyways, but yeah, Crowley is the guy for sex magic for very, very obvious reasons. He kind of made it his thing. There's another entity that's called the Ordo Templi Orientis. They weren't started by Aleister Crowley. It was started by Karl Kellner and Theodor Reuss in either Germany or Austria. Now, Karl Kellner, he either took the higher up rituals in the OTO, which were sex magic based. The lower stuff wasn't, but the higher up you go, then sex magic gets introduced. That was either taken like wholesale from Paschal Beverly Randolph. There's some conjecture about this, and the conjecture is basically, no, he didn't take it from Paschal Beverly Randolph. Somebody else did, and then Karl took it from that guy. So again, Paschal Beverly Randolph is a huge figure for this. Anyways, Crowley became a member of the OTO, and he became its most notorious member, and it eventually became the head of the order. Now I'm going to read in Crowley's words what actually happened here. And I'm going to try and do my best Aleister Crowley impersonation here. Have you ever heard the voice of Aleister Crowley?
Yeah. I think the recording that I heard of him was later in his life, though. So I don't know what he sounded like as a young man, but he sounded a lot more frail than I expected him to when I heard him.
So I'm going to try and do his frailer voice. So this is from Aleister Crowley, what he had to say about the OTO and sex magic. Shortly after publication of the OHO, the outer head of the OTO came to me. He said that since I was acquainted with the supreme secret of the order, I must be allowed the 9th degree, and obligated in regard to it. I protested that I knew no such secret. He said, but you have printed it in the plainest language. I said that I could not have done so because I did not know it. He went to the bookshelves, taking out a copy of the Book of Lies. He pointed to a passage. It literally flashed upon me. The entire symbolism not only of Freemasonry, but of many other traditions blazed upon my spiritual vision. From that moment, the OTO assumed its proper importance in my mind. I understood that I held in my hands the key to the future progress of humanity. So that's...
that was really good impression.
Thank you. And that's the kind of highfalutin thoughts that Aleister Crowley had about himself, but also about sex magic. Yeah, he thought that sex magic was like the ultimate secret of magic. Now, there's some people that say like, well, what passage in the Book of Lies did he talk about? And I actually brought out my copy, dusted off my copy of the Book of Lies, and I'm going to share Crowley had in here, and maybe this was the passage that Theodor Reuss confronted Crowley with. So here we go. This is called The Way to Succeed and the Way to Suck Eggs. This is the holy hexagram. Plunge from the height, O God, and interlock with man. Plunge from the height, O man, and interlock with the beast. The red triangle is the descending tongue of grace. The blue triangle is the ascending tongue of prayer. This interchange, the double gift of tongues, the word of double power, abrahadabra, is the sign of the great work. For the great work is accomplished in silence, and should behold, not that word equal to Teth, that is cancer, whose sigil is, and then it shows the sigil for cancer. This work also eats up itself, accomplishes its own end, nourishes the worker, leaves no seed, is perfect in itself. Little children, love one another. So what do you think he was talking about there, Luxa?
Well, I think that, okay, so what I got from that is that he's talking about the symbolism of the like 6-pointed star, the interlocking water and fire, also associated with male and female, or heaven and earth. Yep. It's a little Heroes Gamos kind of action here, maybe. I don't know.
A little bit, but I think there's a bit of a give in what chapter this is of the Book of Lies. This is chapter 69. And if you've seen the symbol of Cancer, what does it kind of look like?
It looks like a 69.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
See,
the
that's
way
hilarious.
To succeed.
I'm sorry, that's so funny.
Yeah. Again, he thought he was a hilarious guy.
Well, maybe he is. I don't know.
That is kind of clever. I mean, yeah, but...
I mean, I sort of, just from like an Aresian standpoint of like poking fun at all these like stuffy Victorian, like, you know, I don't know, there's something kind of fun about it.
There is, definitely. In Book of Lies, it's probably Crowley at his funniest. Like, it's actually a pretty funny book to read. And he was possessed by something when he wrote it, because, yeah, there's lots of really charming things in there. There's lots of really sly winking things like that. But it was Robert Anton Wilson in Cosmic Trigger 1. He basically said that, I know that this is the passage that made the OTO think that Alistair Crowley knew their secrets and blah, 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 blah. And then from there, Robert Anton Wilson did his own sex magic rituals and things like that. The whole thing about sex being the ultimate point of magic. Anyways, Crowley and sex magic, through him, it becomes the most powerful form of magic, bar none. And using sex to accomplish your will becomes, for a time, the purpose of magic in some way. But the one-time secretary of Aleister Crowley, a gentleman by the name of Israel Regardi, he did a job of providing and promulgating Aleister Crowley's sex magic after Aleister Crowley passed away. And he also tied it in with another figure who we will talk about shortly by the name of Wilhelm Reich. But let's talk about somebody who's a little bit more interesting, like not more interesting, but just comes at things from a different angle. And this is Maria de Niclowska. Now, she was a Russian occultist in the early 20th century. She was also a writer. She published much of Paschal Beverly Randolph in French, which kind of made the continental European sex magic, like that's where it starts. And it starts with Maria's translations of Paschal Beverly Randolph. She was huge in the Paris Surrealism movement. She was also the founder of the Brotherhood of the Golden Arrow, which is an occult society which was all about sexualized ritual. Now, her sex magic was about transformative power of sex. Once sex is ritualized, she also talked about things like erotic asphyxiation, which I don't suggest for people. I mean, do you, but just, there's a lot of stories about autoerotic...
Please be safe.
Yeah.
Please be safe.
Yeah, be safe. Through everything, just be safe. But she was, for a time, very influential figure. Lucifer and Satan were big for her. Not as big as, say, somebody like LaVey, obviously, but she used Satan in like a very sensationalist way. Very cool, I think, though. She was not as scandalized as other figures, but it took her work until 2012 to be published in English. People had noted that, you know, she was kind of sensationalistic in her use of like Satanism and stuff. And I wonder to what extent it was really important for her to be able to like make money off of her writing, because she was supporting herself and her children with it after her husband kind of fucked off. Yep. I could kind of see a little bit of like, you know, giving her a little license to say like, okay, yeah, if you had to like talk about Satan a bunch to make people buy your shit, that's okay. I don't know, right? Like, yeah. I think it came from a sincere place, though. I think it did. I mean, a lot of her ideas are what we would probably call like Luciferian. Yes. There's a lot of talk about light, all kinds of stuff. Yeah. Yeah, she's definitely a figure worth looking up. And who knows? Again, I'm handing out podcast episodes everywhere, this one. But I think that I could definitely do a full episode on Maria de Niclowska. Like, she's a very fascinating figure. Yeah, in researching for this, like, I really was just intrigued by her. And I do have a quote here from the Commandments of the Third Term of the Trinity. And this is from Advanced Sex Magic, the Hanging Man Initiation. As you noted, the whole asphyxiation thing is part of it here. But, and, you know, actually, I do want to note, like, reading this text, there was something about it that reminded me a lot of reading the Alchemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucius. Yeah. Like, there was a sort of like surrealist element to it, which makes sense because of, you know, her background and everything. But so I almost wonder like how much of this is allegorical too. I don't know. It just had that kind of vibe to it. This is the commandments of the third term of the Trinity. 1, you will recognize God in yourself and around you and in the whole universe. For all that is visible and invisible is the result of the life of God, the only being that can say, I am. The flesh says, I was, and I will be. Life says, I am. You will recognize yourself as the servant of life, your God, or of God, your life,
And you will not adore any invisible or visible indeterminate force, for whoever adores an indeterminate force belongs to that indeterminate force and perishes with it when its time has expired. Belong to him who is, and not to him of whom one will say he was. Do not give any name to your God, your life, because a name is a prison and God has no walls. The name begins with the breath, and the breath passes and is repeated in another time, always the same, endlessly different. No name is eternal. How can you give one to him who continues on? And this is my favorite, number 4. You will build a temple to adore your God, your life, for your cares are impure, and you need a place to enter into, washed of your cares.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's just really cool. Like, I read this and I was like, fuck yeah, okay.
It's strange, though, because, I mean, figures like Maria and Ida, they're definitely not talked about as much as the boys' club that is sex magic. But they're getting their due. I mean, it took till 2012 for a lot of Maria's work to get published, any of it to get published in English. So things are changing, but man, it's definitely, to begin with, from the 19th century onwards, it's definitely a boys' club, which unfortunately historically is not true. And I hold Ida and Maria as up there with just being as important to the evolution of sex magic as any of the other guys.
Totally.
So let's talk a little bit about handsome Jack Parsons.
Oh man, this guy.
This guy.
This guy.
He was a student of Alistair Crowley. He was American. He was also a rocket engineer. I don't want this to sound hyperbolic, but we don't go to the moon unless we're Jack Parsons. Like, Jack Parsons was the guy that, like, his way of being able to create liquefied gas got us to the moon. So there we are. He's got a crater on the moon named after him. Incredibly interesting figure, but he is most known for, within occult circles, for what is called the Babylon working. What to say about the Babylon? What would you say about the Babylon working, Luxa?
Well, I would say that you could probably sum it up by saying it was a long working that he was assisted by the famous, or maybe infamous. L. Ron Hubbard, founder of the Church of Scientology.
Yeah.
So they were trying to find a Babylon, like a Whore of Babylon figure, a woman, who they could produce a moon child with, which is a sort of like Antichrist baby, I guess, would be a way of summing it up. So they wanted to make an Antichrist baby, but first they needed like the mom for it. So they were doing this working to make that happen.
Yeah. The person that they got involved was somebody that Jack was very, very enamored with, by the name of Marjorie Cameron. Marjorie's actually, people have for a long time actually given her quite a bit of props for just how involved she was in Jack's life. So that's one person that I think that they do have their due. And she kind of held her own. Even after her death, people were still discovering Marjorie Cameron. A lot of that also is helped out by Kenneth Anger. She featured in one of Kenneth Anger's films.
I mean, and even Alistair Crowley, when he heard about this, he's like, what the fuck, guys? Like, why are you doing this?
Well,
right? Like,
I've read his letters. His letters to Jack they're pretty, like, I'm not going to say they're supportive. They're more like, okay, cool, interesting.
Yeah, and Jack Parsons is like, oh yeah, this guy, Hubbard, he's super great. He's super thelemic, like he's the greatest, most thelemic person that I've ever met. And Crowley's like, really? Okay. And then anybody familiar with the story knows what happens afterwards. Sadly enough, but yes.
Yeah, so Crowley, he was like, okay, interesting, you guys are doing that. But outside of when Crowley would talk to some of his friends, he would slag off Jack Parsons. Like, he was really cruel behind Jack Parsons' back. And that's just what Crowley do. Crowley,
I think that we maybe should just point this out. Like, the way that he treated people was not okay.
No.
It was like super not okay. And you just see like just this kind of like miasma of swirling around him. Like, so many of his close contacts ended up like going insane or committing suicide, or like, I mean, I'm sorry. Like, it's just not okay.
There's some good stories about Alistair Crowley. Some people are like, yeah, he'd give you the shirt off his back, but he ruined a lot of people's lives. a ton of them. And it's not like, well, they kind of ruined their own lives. It's like, no, Aleister Crowley ruined their life. Like, we can't say that Aleister Crowley wasn't a monster sometimes, because he was. Yes. He called himself the Beast. And I know that is such a platitude for me to say. But I've read more biographies of Aleister Crowley than I have any other figure, probably ever. And he does not come off good in a lot of his interactions with other people.
So, I mean, just based on his actions alone, I mean, just the like kind of cut and dry, this is what happened. I mean, we could definitely say that he was an abusive person, right? Yeah. Like, yeah. For sure.
He was like, yeah, okay, Jack, whatever. But then behind his back, he's like, what the fuck is this idiot doing? Like, I don't get this guy. Like, I don't get it. But Jack Parsons, he kind of Americanized Aleister Crowley's sex magic somewhat. I mean, it was basically Aleister Crowley's magic. But as the Americans do, they always kick it up a notch. So, of course, they want to create the Antichrist.
America.
America. Do it. We have the power to blow up the moon. Let's do it. It's a Mr. Show joke. I'm old. Anyways, Jack Parsons.
South Park, now that we've discovered heaven, should we declare war on it?
That's right. Jack, also a bit of a tragic figure. He blew himself up, or did he, before he and Marjorie Cameron were planning to move to Mexico in 1952. It's very sad. That's Jack Parsons, Handsome Jack. There's a couple of other figures that just lightly touch on. Rosalie Norton. I did a whole episode about Rosalie Norton. Huge into sex magic and a very interesting thing. And I will say now, if you haven't seen it yet, when I made that episode about Rosalie Norton, there was a documentary that hadn't been made yet about her. If you're listening to this episode, it has been made. Go find The Witch of King's Cross about Rosalie Norton. Very good. Have a watch and enjoy the wonder that is Rosalie Norton. I think another person that needs to be known about more. Like, very incredibly interesting, the way that she involves sex and ritual in her life. Very cool. Austin Osman Spare. I did a whole episode on Austin Osman Spare. Really enjoyed having sex with what he considered ugly people.
Some of what he was talking about is like this idea of like recontextualizing things, like this idea of like this kind of like mental dexterity, or what I think maybe Peter J. Carroll would later call like sleight of mind.
Right.
Too. I think it might be kind of tied up in there. Yeah. Not sure. Just a hunch that I have about that. But
yeah. And something I didn't talk about in the Austin Osman Spare episode was it's called The Earthenware Virgin. Have you heard of this? Yeah, okay. It's basically it's making a fleshlight out of an earthenware jar and then burying it. And according to Kenneth Grant, according to Austin Osman Spare, it is the most powerful and dangerous form of magic ever. And you bury it and then you dig it up and then you add more of your ejaculate, and it creates something that
I've heard some really gross stories on the internet about people doing similar things in more modern times for less arcane reasons.
Yeah, for a lot of these guys, again, I've said it before and I'll say it again, they lived like this so you don't have to. So just like, and I get the impulse to try things out. Spare was living in a very different time, so I'll just say that.
As long as you're not hurting anybody or yourself, do you.
Okay, there we go. The last figure we're going to be talking about here is a bit of a cheat, but we're going to fit him in regardless. His name is Wilhelm Reich. Now, he was a doctor and psychoanalyst, early 20th century. He was a friend of Sigmund Freud for a while, and then he distanced himself from Freud, or Freud distanced himself from Wilhelm Reich. He's not a sex magician in the true sense, but he's the originator of what is called orgone, which is an esoteric energy or life force. Okay? Now, Wilhelm Reich saw sexuality as the primary energetic force of life, and that the orgasm was the expression of this energetic force. Now, he had a lot of ways of saying that one could accumulate orgone. He said it was like all-pervasive. He said that he could direct its energy. What mainly happened with Wilhelm Reich, he's an entity unto himself. And again, I'm going to do a full episode on Reich. Wilhelm Reich's ideas, they got combined with sex magic due to that secretary of Aleister Crowley's that I talked about earlier, Israel Regardie. Israel Regardie eventually moved to the US. He became a Reichian, and he combined what he knew about sex magic from Aleister Crowley, combined with the ideas of orgone from Wilhelm Reich. And now if you pick up any book on sex magic, a lot of the time the word orgone will be in there because it's just like it's a catch-all phrase for the idea of the energy that is released upon orgasm, male or female or otherwise orgasm, right? So
yeah, I think it's like a mashup of like orgasm and organism.
Yeah.
It's like the organism's energy is expressed in the orgasm, I guess.
Yeah, he's an incredibly interesting figure. He was thrown in jail because of his work. The people thought he was a quack. They chucked him into jail. He died in jail. And the American government, this was, I think, like just over a decade over World War II, when they went to war with a country that used to burn books. They took Wilhelm Reich's books and they burned them all.
Sure. And I think this is really interesting because one thing that I do want to note about Wilhelm Reich is that he was like very critical of fascism. You know, he wrote The Mass Psychology of Fascism. It's this book about like how sexual repression basically like twists your mind and makes you go fascist. It's more complicated than that, but that's kind of the short version of it. I mean, even in like the 60s, like student uprisings in Paris, like people would throw these books at at the police and stuff. So like he's kind of this counterculture figure too. And I think it's interesting that he escapes fascism in Europe only to have his books be burned in America. Again, under the Comstock laws. So here this guy, he rears his ugly head again.
Yeah.
But yeah, like Reich was just like super into like this idea that the better orgasm you could have, the more potent, that was like sort of it for him, like just orgastic potency.
Yeah.
So I do have a quote from him here.
For sure.
Okay, he said, "Sexual release in the sex act must correspond to the excitement which leads up to it. It is not just to fuck, not the embrace in itself, not the intercourse. It is the real emotional experience of the loss of your ego, the whole spiritual self." So he sort of thought that this was like sort of the point of character analysis of like all of these different, like the whole point of all of it was just to have this kind of like ego death through this amazing orgasm, which I'm not going to lie, it sounds like a cool idea.
Very much so.
I can see why it caught on.
He had this idea of armoring, that we all have this kind of armor that we shackle over ourselves from birth. I mean, Freud would call it something like psychoses, but for Reich it was more, not literal, but a crude armor that we put on ourselves due to our repression of sexuality and other things. But sexuality was one of the major ones because he was a Freudian, right? And a way out of that was sexual freedom and being somewhat, not, I want to say cavalier, but just striving towards a healthy sex life and a healthy way of viewing sex. There's literally nothing, like these days now we say something like that and people are just like, yeah, back in Reich's day, that'll
throw
get
him
you,
in jail.
chuck you in jail. you're going to just die there. Yeah. It's so terrible, man. These people, none of them ended life well, truthfully. Maria Niclowska, yeah. But no, it's just a story to be told about most of these people. So those are some of the figures, but let's get to the nitty gritty. Let's get down and dirty. I've used that pun already, but we'll do it again. So what actually goes on with sex magic? It depends who you ask. The word energy gets used a lot for sex magic, and I don't know if a lot of people really have a good definition of energy. I know that I don't, and this is coming from somebody who's like, I can say the word spirit at the drop of a hat, and I still don't have a great definition as to what a spirit is. But energy does get used a lot for sex magic. Things like the word power and taboo and transcendence and transgression get used. Now, there's no real consensus. The majority seem to be in line with what Paschal Beverly Randolph said, is that your will or the law of you is held during arousal, in the act of anything sexual, and in orgasm, and that somehow short circuits reality. Your thing will happen. Just something like that. But if you want a somewhat short summary of what Western sex magic looks like, there's actually a segment in a book that I really don't like by Donald Michael Craig called Modern Magic. It's interesting because it's at bones maybe one of the better introductions to sex magic. Things like breathing in there. So like if you're engaged with a partner, your partner breathes out and then you breathe in as they're breathing out and vice versa. There's things like hand gestures, there's sexual positions, there's visualizations, all of that kind of thing. What we're basically told about sex magic is mainly going to be Crowley based, and it's somewhat old. And it's also going to have a lot of Eastern mysticism chucked in there. There's just so much, and how much of it is useful is up to you, and how much of it is kind of like strange and downright weird is very debatable. What would you say? Like, what exactly entails? I know I asked you earlier, like, what do you think sex magic is, but what do you think sex magic entails, Luxa?
Gosh, that's really, really going to depend on the individual or individuals and the context of the ritual and the purpose of it. I think that it's such a huge question. I mean, even the idea of like, well, what constitutes a sexual act? That's going to be different for different people. Some people feel sexual ways about things that don't come into play for other people, right? Like kink stuff, like people have a fetish about food or something else that doesn't come into play for other people. So that could be, for that person, a sexual act. I think that magic and spirituality is so personalized. Mm-hmm. So is sexuality. And I'm not sure whether there's like a compounding thing that happens there, whether when you add them together or not. But I mean, yes, it's a highly personalized question. I think that in general, I would say that I would encourage people to experiment on their own and kind of find their own context with this through keeping good track of it through journaling and all those other kinds of practices.
Yeah. What do you think sexual energy is? Are you going to go full Reichian? Like, that's a word I hear it get tossed around. I do have a bit of a problem with the word energy because I think that it came out of a period of time where electricity was like starting to come again with that whole thing. And it's just one of those words that stuck. And
sure,
I don't have a proper definition. Nobody has given me a good definition of sexual energy that I'm just like, oh, that's it. Because, and for myself, I don't think I've found it either, right?
Okay, well, I'm not sure. Like, people that are into chaos magic know that there's different models of magic. There's different ways of contextualizing what might make magic work or something. Mm-hmm. But like, maybe we could scoot over to like this psychological model for a second and say that, we're biological organisms, we're sexually reproductive. Right. The continuation of life is a prerogative of living things in general, at least the ones that have survived. And so from a purely psychological standpoint, there's a lot of, maybe you wouldn't need to call it energy. You could call it mental focus impulse. Or, mental space taken up by this urge or psychological infrastructure related to reproduction.
I like it. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Yeah, I don't know if I've ever come across something that really like nails it for me. And you're totally right. I think it's really down to what definition you use. If you are operant in sex magic, if you want to go with an energetics model, absolutely. If you want to go through any kind of auric model, anything works. So it's an interesting one. I think when most people think about how you do sex magic, it's mainly with you and a partner. And then you do certain things, certain parts of it becomes ritualistic, and then one or both of the partners have something in mind, and then it's the act itself. Engaging in the act is both the cause of wanting it to happen, it is the effect of the act itself, and then there's a wish for it to actually happen within their life.
Yeah. And I think that is definitely how a lot of people think about it. But I would say, too, that we should expand the definition to say that, like, you don't necessarily need a partner to do sex magic at all. I would actually say that it's probably beneficial to begin your practice by yourself so that you can familiarize yourself with it before introducing other factors, other people that could be distracting or confusing or, whatever. Building that kind of like relationship with your own understanding of your body and your sexuality is really the, I think, first step to entering this type of practice in general too. And I do also want to note that although a lot of texts focus on this like power of the orgasm and stuff like that is not necessary to do sex magic. Some people do not have orgasms, and that's okay. It's all about the idea of like the excitement that you feel could be contextualized as like a raised energy state. Like you're all amped up or whatever. Right. And so you're focusing that feeling into another ends. So there's practices that don't involve having an orgasm where you get all amped up and you focus that energy into something else. I've played with this a little bit, focusing that into like a creative project or something, and like just really letting it express itself in another way too. So there's, I think the practice is as wide and varied as individuals are.
Yes. I would agree with that 100%. So here's another thing, and I'm really glad that you brought this up in an email that we had a correspondence with earlier, but we're going to touch on it. So since the 19th century, through figures like Paschal Beverly Randolph and Alistair Crowley, they're the most to blame for this, but you get a very specific look regarding sex magic. Now, Paschal Beverly Randolph, he had men as the more active agent during intercourse or during sex magic. And women are, he says like they're not to be impure. He uses the word impure. They're not to be, he's even used the word whore, etc., etc. Now, with Aleister Crowley, let's shit on him a little bit more. He was profoundly misogynistic. He said women have no soul. She is to be obedient to men, but treated fairly and kindly and with justice, blah, blah, blah.
Thanks, dude.
I know. He said that they're morally inferior. His is the sex magic of sperm and reception, right? Now, women, to Aleister Crowley, they were merely receivers of the male energy or the male impulse, and that women are only there to service and help man achieve this kind of magic itself. Now, there has been a huge push against this nonsense recently. I'm just going to call it nonsense. Like, some people will be like, oh, no, he's onto something. No, it's pretty much nonsense. But much of the sex magic from 30 years ago that took this from Crowley has been criticized, and rightly so. And some authors have added extra chapters to their books on sex magic, basically saying like, well, I was mainly talking about this stuff and blah, blah, blah. And it's good to see. We're also seeing a lot more LGBTQ discussions that have been applied to sex magic as well. And in many cases, these voices are getting louder every year, which is really, really good.
I do think that like there is a lot of kind of focus on these, like, I guess, gender roles or whatever within like what we could call classic Western sex magic or whatever. I don't want to speak for other people, but like in terms of like my own understanding and in terms of the understanding of others that I've spoken to, it seems pretty apparent that everybody has access to, you know, maybe there are these different energies, right? Even going on that assumption, everybody has access to these two different energies. This, you know, like idea of a pull or a push or receptive or active or the point or the space or however you want to contextualize it, right? Like it's all kind of the same thing. And I'm really not sure. I this is obviously a debate that continues on and has been going on, whether it's the result of biology or conditioning or whatever it is that, you know, makes people feel different ways. The point is that through like working with this kind of stuff, you can develop both sides of those, or both like contextualizations of the same energy, if you want to like think about it as like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with the semantics of it, but hopefully that the point is clear.
Yeah. This idea that sex magic is only achieved by the man and with Congress with a woman, or even to like go further, is like it can only be done when the male positive force is taken in and conquered over the woman. It's just like, what are you talking about?
As much as we've been shitting on Crowley, like we could even say that like even he didn't seem to think that that was always the case. I mean, he conducted sexual magic with members of the same sex and all kinds of stuff. So, so obviously you can do sex magic in more ways than just with a vagina and a penis together.
There's more than one way to skin a cat, is basically it. It is going away. This idea of gendered sex magic is just, it's a tiresome conversation, and luckily it's passing. A lot of the people that have really held on to it, they're, well, I'm just going to say it, they're dying. Like, they're usually the older guard. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, I don't know. If those ideas, like, work for you in your life, that's cool. I'm not trying to shit on anybody's thing that's working for them, but, you know, also maybe understand that there's other ways of contextualizing it that work really well for other people. So, yeah.
For sure. Yeah. So let's talk about something that's not too happy to talk about. I know this conversation's been fun and freewheeling, but...
But you got all those creepy emails. We need to address this.
Yeah. So let's talk about the dark side. So taking sex magic as the ultimate magic leads to some dark places. There are certain people that will say things about sex magic that are downright stalkerish. The word power gets used a lot by certain people as well. A lot of times there will be just rampant sexism involved with people because they have this idea of certain roles that people have within their life and that they have control over these roles. There's also, as we touched on earlier, the amount of shady things that have occurred in many orders, not just Thelemic-based orders, but orders in neo-paganism. I've even heard of strange things in Masonic orders. Sex magic is one of those things that it gets roped in with a lot of really unbecoming behavior. Even besides this, reducing other traditions to being only about sex or taking older and not well understood mysteries and saying that it is all about sex does nobody any favors ever. A lot of times when people try to push this, I'm just like, I don't know, dude. Like, I don't think that that's the proper read at all. At all. But like any obsession, it doesn't usually go to pleasant places. Obsession on anything can be a very unhealthy thing. So if you are one of those people that thinks that sex magic is the ultimate magic, just be aware of what your behaviors are and how you treat other people, truthfully. I don't know if you can speak to that at all, Luxa.
Well, I feel like that's just good general advice. I mean, no matter what, be aware of how your behaviors influence other people. In general, there's a lot of questions about ethics and stuff, but I think a good touchstone is like, well, how are my actions affecting people, right? Yeah. So I think that's a great point. And I think that maybe a good place to throw this in here would be right now to say, like, if your interest in sex magic really hinges on the sex part of the phrase, I would just do that. Like, you don't need to do sex magic to have an excuse to have sex. Just have sex. Like, that's cool. There's nothing wrong with going for that. It's a perfectly normal human or animal or biological need to fulfill. Yeah. So you don't need to make any excuses to yourself by saying, oh, I'm doing this magical operation. No. The magical operation, like doing the sex magic, it might not even be as fun as just doing sex for sex's sake.
Right.
You're adding these other things into it that are like other layers. It has the potential to almost take away from the enjoyment of the sex. Like, if you're not experienced and if you're not really cognizant of how you've constructed the ritual or whatever. So yeah, if you just want to have sex, that's totally cool. Just ask for that. Yeah. Don't get confused about it. Yeah. I mean, and like anything, like if you are asked to participate in a ritual, like, and goes with any kind of ritual, not just sex magic, but like make sure that you feel 100% comfortable. Mm-hmm. Trust your instinct. There's nothing wrong with wanting to know exactly what you're going to be asked to do beforehand. What you had brought up, Doug, is a really important point about, like, you know, some of the misconduct that can take place in some of these structures. And I think that, like, what we see there is really just the problem of people abusing their authority. And we see that in all kinds of other contexts other than just in, like, magical groups, right? Thinking about politicians and other stuff like that. So, but yeah, so there's always that potential, right? Like, whenever there's a kind of imbalance of power, there's the potential for abuse. The imbalance of power is also something that can make things really exciting with, like, you get into the idea of, I don't know, BDSM or like power exchange stuff. Be cognizant, be aware, trust your instinct. You know, I know this is a great show to give book recommendations on. This is not a magical book, but I do think it's actually a really good one for people to read. It's called The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker.
Okay.
And this is a book just about recognizing danger signs about people's behavior and like what that might mean. So
okay.
Especially if you're like a feminine person, I would super recommend reading that book, or anybody actually in the world.
There's something I say quite a bit on, more so on my Patreon, but it's more about intuition over precision for certain things. And I think this idea of intuition is one that's not talked about a lot within magical circles because it's tough to teach and it's tough to put into books. And intuition and instincts are one of those things that it's not that you have it. You can grow your intuition. But if you're getting very intuitive signs that something is not right, listen to that. Specifically if you are involved in groups.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not everybody is 100% cool with what's happening and with what's about to happen. Like, take a step back, you know?
Nobody will think less of you, and if they do, fuck them. Like, that's, sorry, not fuck them, but
real.
you know what I'm saying. Get rid of them, right? Like,
yeah, forget them.
Forget about them. I'm going to say it. Groups that have sex magic as a part of their system of grading, there has been a lot of shady shit that has happened within these groups, and I hear about them on a near constant basis. It's one of those things that I don't want to say it, but I will. It's baked in somehow, and it sounds really cruel. I have never been involved in any kind of a magical organization, but just hearing the amount of stories, it does not make me very optimistic about a lot of the future of these orders. And I'm not talking about one specifically. I want people to understand that. I have friends in several occult orders, but I also have just tons and tons of stories of people who have been taken advantage of and just the worst kind of things happening. Just the worst. So
yeah, and that's really sad, you know, because even just doing magic with somebody, it can be like a vulnerable position. And when you enter into like introducing like sexuality into that compounding thing. And so it's so unfortunate. Like, it's not to like, you know, be scared or whatever, but just be aware and really trust your instinct, trust your gut. And if it doesn't feel like super cool and you're not super into it, for real, don't do it. You don't have to do it.
No.
Fuck it. Or really, like, you know,
get out.
Like, forget it.
Yeah. Yes. So speaking of obsession, let's talk about religion. Because if there's one group that is really obsessed with sex, a lot of them are religions. Now, for the West, the Bible is the foundational text of so much of our lives. From the very beginning, there's this idea of Adam and Eve and the story of taking an apple from the tree because Eve was told by the serpent, which could be the devil or might not be the devil. And that caused humanity's fall. We were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, etc., etc. I actually have a really interesting thing to share here from one of my favorite people ever, Jeffrey Kripal. Here's what he has to say about this little parable. So he says, "The fruit was clearly not just sex, as we use the word much too loosely today. Rather, the fruit functions in the story as a type of erotic gnosis that was understood to affect immediately both moral awareness and the partial divinization of the human being. The fruit of the knowledge of good and evil that the knowing serpent offers the couple to eat, after all, is understood by the myth to be both a kind of partial divinization and a preparatory stage to the couple awakening more fully to their own immortal natures. Indeed, God states quite clearly that the couple has already become like one of us through the act of eating the fruit, which implies that sex is divine, exactly as the serpent promised, and later points out that, should the couple manage to eat of the second tree of life, they would live forever, that is, they would become gods. In a rather tragic way for Western religious thought, then, the story seems to suggest that God stands against our own moral maturity, against sexuality, and against the divinization of human nature through the acquisition of knowledge and sensual pleasure. It also insinuates that we all die because of our first parents knew each other within the intimate gnosis of sexual intercourse. Because they fucked, we're screwed. Through this troubling logic, the serpent's gift was turned into an ancient curse, and the gracious giver into the devil himself. The fruit still hangs before us, and the serpent still hisses its promised gift, and it is up to us to know what comes next, that is, how we shall tell the story from here." So, let's talk a little bit, Luxa, about something like taboo and transgression. which is a huge part, I think, of sex magic in some way. Though the importance that sex has on our lives is vast. We're constantly told the importance of sex, how great it is. We're told that it has psychological functions. What do you have to say about this idea of shame and guilt involved with sex, and how sex magic can be a way to perhaps help in this in some regard?
Well, gosh, yes, there's a lot there. First of all, I want to say I love Jeffrey Kreifel. Hey. Still, the flip when I read it, like, it rearranged everything for me. So thank you for the recommendation.
No worries.
Amazing episode with him, by the way, too.
Oh, stop it.
People haven't heard that, definitely check it out.
I agree.
Yeah, no, I think this is a big one, right? And I think that, you know, as we kind of touched on before, like, this drive towards reproduction is such an important psychological component that we have, that it really does make sense that whatever authority structure might be in place would want to use this as kind of like a fulcrum point for keeping people in line with the ideas that this authority has to say. So, I mean, I think that makes sense that we see that there's these kind of rules and about, like, you know, what you're supposed to do and who you're supposed to do it with. I guess we could also, just to play devil's advocate with myself, I would say that there might be something there too about, like, having a society where, you know, we can't just have people, like, running all over the place doing whatever they please. You know, there's got to be some kind of check and balance to it too. So I'm not saying that it's completely bad or anything, but I do think that playing with that push and pull, like, these ideas that we've all been taught as we grow up based on the culture that we live in about, like, what sex is and how we should do it and all that stuff. Like, there is a lot of, I think, shame associated with it for a lot of people. I think that working with that and working to kind of, like, undermine some of that. I mean, in chaos magic, we talk about this in the context of, like, deconditioning or whatever.
Right.
But, like, working with those ideas and kind of undoing that in a introspective way can be a really easy way to gain a lot of personal agency.
Yes. It's strange for Christianity. I'm going to talk about Christianity specifically, because for a religion that in its inception was about breaking taboos, they were necromantic. They were carting body parts in Rome, which was, it displeased everybody in Rome. It was so egregious to everybody. In a way, they became, like, not the thing that they hate, but they became so distant from their roots and their ideas of taboo that they set up some of the most stringent taboos that ever existed in world history, basically, through a long history of taboos. It's a necessary means of control for, I'm going to say, churchianity as opposed to Christianity, because the Bible doesn't really talk, or at least the New Testament doesn't really talk about sex that much at all, really. So it's one of those things where I say, yeah, this idea of personal knowledge, the Gnostics can help, I think, in a way, if you really want to understand, like, your personal knowledge of sex and sexuality and transgression is very important, as well as your experiences are the ones that you should guide you. So in a way, the taboos based around sexuality within a Christian context, they're an interpretation, right? And they're an interpretation of the Bible's stories themselves. With that, one hand takes away, and yet another hand gives it. So let's talk a second here about the Lucifer myth. Now, are you familiar with this at all?
The general myth of the angel that was so beautiful, and he was the coolest one, and he was like, hey, God, can't I be like you? And God's like, no, fuck you. Get out of here.
There's another part to this story that not a lot of people know. And it comes from Genesis 6. It is right before the flood, right before the part of the book where God's like, fuck it all and get rid of them all. And it's
all of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting tidbit. So the story goes like this, that angels were lured to earth via the charms of women, the daughters of men, who they had sex with, producing giant children, okay?
Definitely.
The angels also taught humankind many skills, such as working with metals and working with herbs and other, I'm just going to say, downright witchy things. And that this drawing down of heavenly spirits, if we can call them, this is the original Sabbath. This is the witches' Sabbath. and it's right there in the Bible, which although some would relegate to being a myth, and yet in some ways, I like this idea. This is something that Peter Gray and Alkistis Demetch from Scarlet Imprint have been publishing a lot on recently, more specifically in their book, The Brazen Vessel. The story is it's pure Yahweh propaganda. That the women are, of course, blamed for everything, right? It's the women that caused the corruption of the angels, so they're meant to shoulder the blame. And then, of course, there's a flood. This idea is one that I can get behind, which is the idea of a sexual charm becoming somehow necessary for magic in some way, and that how you can't really separate sex from magic or from witchcraft. More specifically to witchcraft, I'd say. What's also interesting about this is that I think there's a focus on the body as well, and that the sexual charm that caused these spirits to come down was ritualistic in some way, and that either we can take from this story this idea that perhaps what's great about magic, and magic done well, is that it is both corporeal and spiritual in some way, seemingly. So I do think it's hard to separate sexuality from witchcraft. And this is, I think, a way that a lot of people can get around this very strange mindfuck that churchianity has done on us. What do you think of this idea, Luxa? This drawing down the spirits through sexual charm?
I think it's really interesting. I'm getting this kind of Heroes Gamos vibe of like, you know, the union of the earth and the heavens, right? Like, I do think it's interesting. There's like this kind of like trope where we have this like necessary story element of this temptation that's there. Like these women, they're just so beautiful, or whatever. Why are they being so tempting or whatever? Like it's like the thing that needs to happen for this like story to take place. Yeah. And then we have this like kind of scapegoat. I'm just struggling with like the logic of this. Yeah. I wasn't raised in a religious background. No. So when I hear these kinds of stories, there's always like a lot of calculations that are going on for me about like, well, God was the one that made the women so sexy. So like, wait a minute, I don't know. I think it is interesting though, like this idea of the body calling down the divine. Yeah. And it's sort of like, I know we don't like to talk too much about the whatever people call the Kabbalah these days. Right. You did an episode about that. But in that kind of like context, because I do think it's useful for talking about things sometimes because it's good language for so many different people. Yeah. We could say that like, these things are in the realm of the idea, the moon, and you saw it, right? And the body is what brings them down to earth, right? Yeah. The Malkuth or whatever. So like, yeah, I think that there's something fun there for sure.
This idea of the witch's Sabbath being more of a myth, but a useful and fantastic myth, that the original Sabbath was one where the divine visited us because of it. And without this Sabbath, much of what we call magic, we just don't have. The angels taught us things, right? Like the angels gave us this understanding to be able to do these things. I love it. And I think it's one of those things that, I'm not saying my magic has been going this way more frequently, but, and this may be a really, really at base, simplified way of looking at it, but approach ritual as a seduction is something that recently has been very much on my mind. With the time that I've had over the last year and a half since reading The Brazen Vessel and the work of Peter Gray and Alkistis Demetch, it's very interesting when you approach your ritual as a seduction. There's something to it.
I love that. Yeah, no, absolutely. And like touching on some of the deity work that I do, like I do think about it, maybe not in those directive terms, but I think about it as like dating, right? Like I want to like really get to know this thing or energy, however you like to think about it. Right. I mean, whatever, who cares? But yeah, no, this idea of making the conditions for that to happen. Like you could even, taking it away from sex magic, you can think about it as gardening, like you can't force the seed to grow, but you can create the conditions for it. So like, yeah, definitely.
It's great stuff. I really enjoy it. And it's worth reading. If you can wrap your head around it, it's somewhat simple. the Luciferian myth. I'm just going to actually really quickly give it just the once over to maybe hammer it home, and then we'll move on. The Lucifer myth is this. In essence, it is that women have been taught witchcraft by angels, that women have drawn spirits down with their sexual charm, that sexual power and magical power are inseparable. At the heart of witchcraft is an eroticized and transformative teaching encounter where we receive wisdom, whether from the dead, fairy, angels, or others. The costumes worn by the at times benefic and other times predatory interlopers are local and specific. So in short, that's basically the Lucifer myth, and Peter's work goes through all of it. To wrap up here,
okay.
Luxa, is sex magic really all that important? And what do you think the best approaches for sex magic are? And is it just down to the individual?
Cool. So this is like a 3-4. I like it.
Yeah, let's do it. It's a menage a trois question. Again.
Menage a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so is it that important? Well, I really think that depends on the individual and your practice.
Okay.
I would say that, like, in a generalized sense, yes, probably in terms of like understanding the tradition, then that's a huge part of it. And you would want to study that if that's your goal, is to sort of understand things in a holistic way.
Right.
But in terms of actually practicing and how important that will be, that's really going to depend on you and what you find to be useful and helpful in your own life.
Yeah.
The second part of that was,
what do you think the best approaches are for somebody who has not engaged in sex magic ever? Like, how does one start? How does one get into it?
well, I would say again that these practices really do hinge on, as you mentioned, like on yourself and on your own like body and your understanding of that. So I would recommend that people take the time to really get familiar and comfortable with that. Take some time to do some solo sex magic. Take some time to do some introspection to understand what makes you the most aroused. If you're a person who has an orgasm, maybe you could play around with some of Reich's orgastic potency and see what kind of things does that for you. Like there's all kinds of techniques and everything out there.
Yeah.
I would say, too, that if you're going to be bringing things into your practice, like pornography or whatever, like I would be very, very cognizant of that.
In what way? Because this is something you brought up earlier. Why do you think that pornography is... I know of people that are very enamored of pornography, and in some ways it's even an addiction. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so can you elucidate a little bit more on that?
Well, I think that going with a sort of like base theory that you're going to be like concentrating your like will on this effect of this operation, introducing somebody else's, when somebody made this pornographic movie or whatever, I sound like I'm like 70 or a pornographic movie that you see in the theater.
A blue film. Oh, what they're making.
Whatever it is that you're enjoying.
Yeah.
Somebody made it for the intention of doing something with, probably making money.
Correct.
So like that intention is mixed up with your own intentions. This is just my own conceptualization of things.
Right.
Obviously, people will have different opinions and things are going to work differently for different people. This is just for me. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there's the potential of like, getting things all tangled up and to really like, build up your focus and build up your ability to like channel this energy. It's probably best if you can eliminate those kinds of, I don't want to say crutches, but like these kinds of like aids. Like it's probably better to be able to really focus that within your own person.
Yeah.
Again, my own opinions. Everybody's going to have different ideas about this. And I would highly encourage people to experiment for themselves and to take good notes. Journaling is so important because how else will you figure out what is working for you or not? So, yes.
So you do think it is somewhat down to the individual to find their own way, just like the best magic, truthfully.
Based on my own experience, like I've read lots of, people's ideas about sex magic and I found them useful and helpful and interesting. But in terms of what I've actually been able to like glean from the practice, it really has just come down to practicing.
Yeah.
And
doing the work.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Strange to hear it again. Just do the work.
Yeah. I'm going to end my little final thoughts here with a story. And this goes to the question of best approaches. I think go back to the original conception of sex magic, hieros gamos, which is to take the form of something else as a ritual. Now, one of my first dalliances with sex magic, in a way, was straight out of Grant Morrison's wonderful essay in the Disinformation Book of Lies. He basically says that if you wanted to feel something incredibly different, you can evoke like god forms, but they can be in any sense. And this is like late 90s pure chaos magic. So I was seeing somebody and I decided to give it a shot. So who am I going to invoke? Well, of course, I was a huge movie fan. Who's the baddest motherfucker and sexiest motherfucker at the same time around? Well, that's going to be James Bond. So I psyched myself up. Hey, I know. Hey, I was 21. I was literally, I lost my virginity at 21. Like, I was pretty old. But yes, I made myself James Bond. I had a suit. I put on John Barry's score. I studied the way that he moved. I just made myself James Bond. And I will say, from experience, probably the best sex of my life was when I made myself James Bond. I really do think that there's something to this aspect of sex magic that is entirely wonderful. And I think as far as a way to get into sex magic, yes, the solo stuff is good. But to move into practices that are not just solo, this idea of role-playing but magically, the term skinwalking has been used, like when people evoke the god Dionysius or something like this, to give this god another walk on this earthly plane, you know. I really think there's something to this, and I think that it's actually quite wonderful. I gotta say, James Bond is, I mean, again, this is really, really base level 90s chaos magic, but my goodness, it worked, and my goodness, it was really quite wonderful. So thank you to James Bond and Ian Fleming.
I love that. No, that's a fantastic story. That's very fun. And yeah, exactly. And I didn't want to make it seem like I was just saying that you should only do solo sex for your sex magic practice. But that is where I would certainly start.
Definitely. I would agree with that for sure. Is it that important? I think it is. I think sex magic and at least being able to be at base comfortable in your body and comfortable with your body sexually, that is a very important thing. There's a lot of people that are not comfortable with their bodies and are doing things about it, and bless them all. That's fantastic. But I think a lot of times if you are okay with your body and in some way you're okay with how your body operates sexually, that I think is important. As a magician, I do think that in some way leads to a certain level of self-love, which is something Crowley and Austin Oz and Spare talk about as well. They're not idiots when they talk about this stuff. I think that in a way, one of the best conduits for doing that is through some form of being able to set up a temple and be able to worship yourself first. That is a very crucial step, and I think that sex magic is tied into that in some way. So
fuck yeah, I totally agree. I think that that's huge. Yeah. Definitely.
The body, as far as we know, you only get one of them, and
be nice to it.
Be nice to it and enjoy it. There's something that we haven't talked a lot about, and maybe I brought it up a bit in my story, but the amount of fun one can have with sex magic is really awesome. We've been talking about a lot of highfalutin stuff, but just the amount of fun that one can have is amazing, right?
Yeah. I mean, and just like the feelings of freedom and agency and transcendence and awe, really, that you can encounter in these practices is not to be scoffed at.
Not at any way. So at base, Doug's guide to sex magic is, first of all, have fun. Second of all, love yourself in some way and truly love yourself and be earnest with how much you love yourself.
Get really good at masturbating.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. Another thing, I think that transgression is to be used in some way. I think that there's something to be said about transgression and witchcraft. I mean, I'm not going to shit on people that are witches and nothing that they do is transgressive. Again, transgression is entirely subjective. But if you think that it's transgressive in some way, I say poking in that direction can lead you to certain places.
Sure, that's where you might have an opportunity to grow.
Definitely.
Right?
Yes. Make it sexy. As I said, view ritual as seduction. It's very, very cool.
Hips and nips.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Specifically for spirit-based magic, which is kind of where I land, it should be seen definitely as a ritual of seduction between you and the spirits. And I'm not just saying like dressing up, but just treat it not like you're just going through a process of step after step after step. It's much more conducive when you're seeing it in some way. And I know this is strange coming from somebody who I'm basically going to say is a bit necromantic, approaching the ritual as just a way of seeing that it is an interaction, that you're not the only part of the interaction. It takes two to tango, basically, is what I'll try to say. And in spirits, sometimes it's more than two. So
yeah, and to touch on what you mentioned about the necromancy thing, like I do think just through my own like deity work and stuff, like I have found that these like two currents, this like kind of like sexual life current and this death current, like they're kind of the same thing. They're just two sides of the same coin. Yeah. So I think that actually makes a lot of sense. They're inextricably linked, in my opinion, at least.
Yep, definitely. And finally, I'd say here is my final thought about Doug's Guide to Sex Magic, is that it is your job to disentangle the bits that make sense to you and to get rid of the shit that doesn't. Nobody knows their sex magic better than you do. And that is one of the greatest things about sex magic, is that the magic in general is that when you find out what works and what doesn't, what your journey is and how much fun you're having, that is just a wonderful thing. But there's a lot of baggage with a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of societal things that are involved, and it is your job to disentangle them. Try to make it fun. It's not hard work, but it is work. And,
hard work.
Yeah. So with that, Luxa, this has been 2 hours and 15 minutes of absolute wonder. I mean, we didn't get overly childish. We got a little bit childish, but why the hell not? But,
I curbed my enthusiasm.
This has been so much fun. Luxa, tell us what's happening. What's going on in your world? What's next for you? The Luxa cult is leaps and bounds. Just lots of people on there that are really wonderful. And what's going on in your world?
Just, working on the projects and stuff. And I just feel like super fucking blessed to be working with so many amazing people. Yeah. There's a lot of exciting things happening with the Green Mushroom Project and with my show. I can't really go into it yet, but yeah, all kinds of cool stuff happening. So if people are interested, feel free to hit me up, or if you have any questions about any of my possibly unpopular opinions, please feel free to hit me up about that as well.
Also, I'm just going to say this. If you guys have hate mail to send to Luxa, don't do it. Send it to me. I'm this is my show. I'll get all the hate mail. I
might sound very nice now, but yeah. I'm not always so nice, so.
I can believe it. So yes, your other podcasts, you have Luxa Cult and you have Smuts Up.
Luxa Cult and Smuts Up and Ad Hoc History are the 3 shows that I am working on right now. And yeah, so if anybody is curious about any of that stuff or chaos magic or whatever, I would definitely check out Luxa Cult. You can hear the interview that I did with Doug about all kinds of fun things. That was when I was kind of first getting rolling with the show too. Yeah. So it was fantastic that you were willing to come and talk to me, even though I was just starting out. So
an utter delight. I loved that. I loved that appearance. That's maybe one of my favorite things. You ask such great questions, and it also it's like, oh, you ask about books, and it's like, oh, definitely down to talk about books.
Well, who would be better to ask about books than you?
Stop it. But fantastic. I will have links to every single one of the podcast that Luxa takes part in and produces. They're all wonderful. I've listened to them. They're fantastic. Please check them out, as well as links to find anything else that Luxa gets up to. Those will be available on the show notes to this episode. That will be found at whatmagicisthis.com. WhatMagicIsThis.com is basically the place to find everything that you want. All of the show notes to every single episode. I go out of my way for these show notes. There's going to be some excellent ones for this episode, some excellent resources for sex magic and any direction that you want to go with it. It's going to be covered on those show notes. Also on WhatMagicIsThis.com, you'll find a link to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. I'm pretty active on Twitter and a little bit active on Instagram and Facebook. If you've enjoyed this show, please leave a review for my podcast on iTunes. People do read those reviews on iTunes, and they do judge a podcast on them. So if you really like the show and you want to share your love of the show, one of the kindest things you can do for me is to leave a review. Actually type some words. The star clicky thing on there, that's all well and good. That helps. But if you actually write a few words about me, that would be overly appreciated. Also, if you love the podcast, please tell a friend. Tell a friend that you think might like this whole magic, weird, occult stuff, and who knows, they might like it, and then they might tell a friend, and it just goes from there. Word of mouth is one of the best ways of spreading the love that is What Magic Is This, so please tell a friend that you enjoy the show, and good things will happen to you, I guarantee you. If you really, really, really enjoy the show, one of the best ways of showing your love is to support the podcast on Patreon. I put up new shows every month. They're almost full-length shows. They're about all kinds of different things like entities and spirits and gods, to videos on how I will take you through a certain process of setting up an altar or creating Florida water, all of that kind of stuff. And it's not just me staring at a camera. I actually take you through the whole thing. I have a cinematographer, they help me out, or I just do the cinematography myself, but I don't do things by half measures, I'll just say that. There's also programs about my personal praxis and what I do with my magic, which is all well and good, and people are really interested to see that kind of thing. So if you love What Magic Is This and you can't get enough of it just through the main podcast, the best thing you can do is join the Patreon. It is only $7 a month. I don't have any tiers or anything like that. It's one of those things I just want you to support the podcast, and it's $7 flat rate, and you get access to everything as well as a Discord account that is getting more and more active with each and every week, and we have some great people on there, including some of my former guests. If you're not totally enamored with the whole paying $7 a month kind of thing, but you still want to show your support for the show, I have a PayPal me account. Go to whatmagicisthis.com, click on one of the little PayPal buttons that's there. You can get that, but just going to say you're not going to get the extra content. The best way of getting that is through the Patreon. That is, bar none, the best way of getting more What Magic Is This, as well as a way to support the work that I do. I think I'm doing something kind of important, and I hope that you can say the same thing about my podcast. Patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find one of the many Patreon buttons there. But yes, everything can be found at whatmagicisthis.com. Luxa, this has been such a wonderful time. I hope that if sometime in the future I would ask you to come back on the show, you would.
Oh, absolutely. This has been quite enjoyable, and I've been a fan of the show for quite some time, so fuck yeah, hail Eris. I'm so glad to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here and for finally getting you on. Like, I'm so sorry it took so long, Luxa. It's one of those things where I get carried away. I really do.
This is the perfect timing for me, so I'm cool with it.
Perfect. Wonderful. So that's the show, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed this show on sex magic, and I hope we were able to demystify some things and put some ideas in your head and even some figures to look into, because I think that the figures that you know about sex magic, they might not be the ones you should know. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but
check out Maria.
Yeah.
And keep it sexy and be safe.
Exactly. So with that, I want you all to come back to What Magic Is This, where we'll talk about more of this sexy, seductive, transgressive, taboo breaking, and I'm just going to say it, downright cute podcast. And yeah, until then, I want you all to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. Can we get a goodbye, Luxa?
Take care, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. We'll talk at you soon. Bye-bye.